December 15, 1941. Eastern Front, Soviet Union. Temperature, -20 degrees Celsius. Wehrmacht soldier Werner Goldberg, age 23, crouches in a frozen foxhole near Moscow. He wears the field gray uniform of Hitler's army, the Iron Cross second class pinned to his tunic. He fights for Nazi Germany. But Werner carries a secret that could mean his execution. His father was Jewish. In 1940, his photograph appeared on a Nazi propaganda poster with the caption, "The Ideal German Soldier." The Nazi propagandists didn't know, or chose to ignore, that their ideal Aryan warrior was, by their own racial laws, a Mischling, a person of mixed Jewish ancestry. In a letter smuggled to his family, Werner wrote, "I serve an ideology that considers my father subhuman. I fight alongside men who would send my relatives to camps if they knew the truth. Every day, I live the ultimate contradiction, a half-Jew in Hitler's army. I don't know if I'm protecting my family by serving or condemning myself by this impossible loyalty." This is the story of the Mischling who served in the Wehrmacht and the unbearable moral paradox they endured. Werner Goldberg was born in 1919 in Berlin to a mixed family. His father was Jewish, his mother was Protestant German. This made Werner a Mischling ersten grades, a first-degree mixed-race person under the 1935 Nuremberg Laws. These laws categorized German citizens by ancestry, stripping rights from Jews and restricting Mischlinge. However, the Wehrmacht's relationship with Mischlinge was complicated and contradictory. Initially, thousands of Mischlinge served in the German military. Some Wehrmacht commanders valued skilled soldiers regardless of ancestry. Others exploited legal loopholes. The definition of who could serve changed multiple times between 1933 and 1945. Werner grew up in Weimar Germany and early Nazi Germany, experiencing increasing discrimination. His father, a World War I veteran who had fought for Germany, faced escalating persecution. Werner attended German schools where Nazi ideology was taught. He witnessed his family's status deteriorate as Nazi racial laws tightened. When Werner reached military age in the late 1930s, he faced an impossible choice: attempt to avoid service and draw attention to his family's Jewish heritage, or volunteer and hope his partial Jewish ancestry went unnoticed or ignored. He chose to serve. In 1938, Werner was conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Germany was rearming and needed soldiers. Local military authorities either didn't investigate his ancestry thoroughly or chose to overlook it. He appeared Aryan, spoke German natively, and came from an educated Berlin family. His father's Jewish heritage wasn't immediately obvious from official documents, especially since his mother was Protestant and Werner had been raised with Protestant cultural traditions. Werner entered basic training at a Wehrmacht facility near Berlin. He proved to be a capable soldier, intelligent, physically fit, and disciplined. He advanced through training without incident. In 1940, his photograph was taken for routine military documentation. That photograph caught the attention of Wehrmacht propaganda officers looking for images representing the ideal German soldier. Werner's sharp features, direct gaze, and proper uniform made him perfect for their purposes. The photograph was reproduced on a propaganda poster distributed throughout Germany and occupied territories. The caption proclaimed him the embodiment of Aryan military virtue. The bitter irony was lost on the propaganda ministry. Their ideal Aryan soldier was classified by Nazi law as racially inferior due to Jewish ancestry. The poster hung in recruitment offices and public spaces. Werner's family saw it with horror and dark amusement. Their endangered Jewish-descended son was Nazi Germany's poster boy. The contradiction Werner embodied was not unique. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of Mishlings served in the Wehrmacht throughout World War II. Some estimates suggest as many as 150,000 soldiers of Jewish descent served in Hitler's military, though exact numbers remain debated due to incomplete records and varying definitions. Most kept their ancestry secret. Some had it overlooked by sympathetic or pragmatic commanders. Others received special exemptions, Durchblutigkeitserklärung, declarations of German blood, signed by Hitler himself, reclassifying them as Aryan for military purposes. The Nazi regime's treatment of Mishlings in the military revealed the contradictions within their racial ideology. They needed soldiers, especially as the war expanded. Skilled and loyal Mischling soldiers presented a dilemma: exclude them and lose military capability, or include them and acknowledge that racial purity was negotiable when convenient. Different branches handled this differently. The Wehrmacht was more flexible than the SS, which maintained stricter racial requirements. Individual commanders made independent decisions. Throughout the war, policies changed multiple times. Mischling soldiers lived in constant fear of discovery or changing regulations. Any investigation into their background could result in discharge, arrest, or worse. Their families faced even greater danger. Many Mischling soldiers served not out of Nazi loyalty but to protect their families, believing that military service might shield relatives from persecution. By June 1941, Werner Goldberg was deployed to the Eastern Front as part of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He served with a Wehrmacht infantry regiment. The Eastern Front was the largest and deadliest theater of World War II, where Nazi Germany's war of annihilation against the Soviet Union resulted in unprecedented casualties and atrocities. Werner faced the same horrific conditions as other Wehrmacht soldiers: brutal combat, extreme weather, inadequate supplies, and the grinding attrition of Eastern Front warfare. But he carried an additional psychological burden. He knew that behind the advancing Wehrmacht came the Einsatzgruppen SS death squads murdering Jews across occupied Soviet territory. He knew that the regime he served considered people like his father subhuman and marked for extermination. He witnessed or heard about atrocities against Jewish civilians. His position was morally impossible. He was helping advance a war of racial extermination that targeted his own ancestry. In letters smuggled to his family, Werner expressed profound psychological distress. He wrote about feeling complicit in horrors while simultaneously trying to survive and protect his family through loyal service. He described comrades casually discussing anti-Semitic ideology, never knowing they fought alongside someone with Jewish heritage. He lived in constant fear of discovery. Any investigation, any suspicious comment, any background check could expose him. The psychological burden of Werner's position intensified throughout 1941 and 1942. He fought in battles outside Moscow in the brutal winter of 1941–42. Like other Wehrmacht soldiers, he endured temperatures dropping to -40 degrees, frostbite, supply shortages, and Soviet counterattacks. But unlike most soldiers, Werner couldn't escape into ideological conviction or hatred of the enemy. He couldn't sustain himself with belief in Nazi racial superiority. He was living proof of its falseness. Instead, he focused on immediate survival and protecting his comrades, trying to separate military duty from the regime's ideology. Fellow soldiers never suspected his background. He looked German, spoke Berlin dialect German, and served competently. Some Mischling soldiers formed quiet networks of mutual support, recognizing each other through careful signals. But most remained completely isolated, unable to share their secret with anyone. Werner later described this isolation as more psychologically devastating than combat itself. In combat, fear was shared with comrades. But his deepest fear of discovery, of his family's persecution because of him, of the moral impossibility of his position, he carried entirely alone. The propaganda poster haunted him. His image, representing Nazi Aryan ideals, appeared across Germany while his father hid his Jewish identity in Berlin, living in fear of deportation. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Werner continued serving on the Eastern Front. He was promoted to Gefreiter, Lance Corporal, based on competent service. He received the Iron Cross Second Class for actions in combat. Each decoration increased his visibility within military bureaucracy, paradoxically making him both more respected and more vulnerable to investigation. By 1943, Nazi policies toward Mischling and the Wehrmacht were tightening. Earlier tolerance was giving way to stricter enforcement of racial requirements. The Reich Security Main Office began systematic investigations of soldiers' ancestry. Thousands of Mischlings were discharged from military service. Some were sent to forced labor battalions. Others were reclassified and faced persecution. Werner's situation became increasingly precarious. Every new directive, every administrative review, threatened exposure. His unit's personnel officers began requesting more detailed ancestry documentation from all soldiers. Werner provided carefully prepared documents that concealed his father's Jewish heritage, but each new request increased the risk of discovery. Meanwhile, news from Berlin brought more horror. Werner learned through carefully coded family letters that relatives had been deported. Jewish persecution intensified into systematic genocide. The Holocaust was underway, murdering millions. Werner was fighting for the regime orchestrating this genocide while carrying Jewish ancestry himself. The moral impossibility of his position reached unbearable levels. In early 1944, Werner's worst fears materialized. A routine administrative review of his unit's personnel files triggered an ancestry investigation. Someone in the Reich Security Main Office noticed discrepancies in his documentation. A formal investigation began into his racial background. Werner was questioned by military intelligence officers about his grandparents and their religious affiliations. The investigation uncovered his father's Jewish heritage. According to Nazi racial laws, this made Werner ineligible for Wehrmacht service. In March 1944, Werner Goldberg was discharged from military service under the classification unsuitable for service due to ancestry. He was ordered to return to Berlin. His military career, the propaganda poster, the Iron Cross, 3 years of combat service ended with a bureaucratic notation about racial unsuitability. Discharge probably saved his life. Remaining on the Eastern Front through 1944–45 meant participation in Germany's catastrophic retreat and likely casualties. But discharge also meant returning to Berlin, where Mischling and Jews faced increasing danger as the regime intensified persecution even while losing the war. Werner returned to Berlin under heavy Allied bombing, where his Jewish father was in hiding, where deportations continued, where the machinery of genocide operated until the regime's final days. Back in Berlin, Werner faced the final year of Nazi Germany's collapse. He lived through intensifying Allied bombing campaigns that destroyed much of the city. He witnessed the regime's desperation and brutality increasing as military defeat became inevitable. His Jewish father remained in hiding with false identity papers. Any discovery meant deportation to death camps still operating even as Soviet armies approached from the east. Werner himself faced danger. Discharged Mischlings were vulnerable to forced labor conscription or worse. Some were sent to organization-tote forced labor battalions. Others simply disappeared into the system. Werner survived by staying inconspicuous, moving frequently, and relying on his mother's Protestant connections. The psychological burden of the previous years manifested in what today we would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He struggled with nightmares, survivor's guilt, and the moral weight of his service. He had fought for a regime attempting to exterminate people like his father. He had worn their uniform, been their propaganda symbol, and received their decorations. How could he reconcile this with his identity and conscience? The moral injury was profound. In April 1945, Soviet forces encircled and attacked Berlin. Werner and his family sheltered in basements during the final battle. The regime that had used his image to represent Aryan ideals while simultaneously classifying him as racially inferior was collapsing around them. On May 2, 1945, Berlin surrendered to Soviet forces. Werner and his father survived. They had endured the entire Nazi period, from 1933's initial persecution through 12 years of escalating racial laws, through the war, through the Holocaust, to final collapse. Survival itself was extraordinary. Millions of German Jews and Mischlings did not survive. Werner's father avoided deportation through luck, false papers, and his son's military service providing some minimal protection during certain periods. After Germany's surrender, Werner faced Allied occupation and denazification. His case was complex. He had served in the Wehrmacht and received Nazi military honors, but as a Mischling persecuted under Nazi racial laws. Denazification tribunals struggled with such cases. Was he a perpetrator for serving in Hitler's military, or a victim for being classified as racially inferior and ultimately discharged? The answer was both. Werner provided testimony about his experience to Allied investigators documenting the Nazi regime. His story, particularly the propaganda poster, became a symbol of Nazi ideology's contradictions and absurdities. The image of the ideal German soldier who was secretly half-Jewish revealed the fraudulence of Nazi racial pseudoscience. Post-war, Werner struggled with profound psychological trauma. He had experienced combat trauma, moral injury, survivor's guilt, and the existential crisis of having served a genocidal regime while being targeted by its ideology. He sought psychological help, but available treatment was limited. Werner Goldberg lived until 2004, dying at age 84. He spent his post-war life in Germany, rarely speaking publicly about his Wehrmacht service. In later decades, as Holocaust education expanded and historians began examining Nazi racial policies' complexities, Werner gave several interviews about his experience. He spoke to Holocaust museums and educational institutions about the contradictions he embodied. He emphasized that his story was not about rehabilitation of Nazi service but about revealing the regime's hypocrisies and the impossible moral positions it forced on people. He was clear that serving in the Wehrmacht, regardless of his ancestry, made him part of Germany's collective responsibility for Nazi crimes. But he also wanted people to understand the psychological torture of being targeted by an ideology while simultaneously serving it. Werner's case became important to historians studying Mischling in the Wehrmacht. Brian Mark Riggs' research, published in Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, documented thousands of similar cases. These stories reveal how Nazi racial ideology was neither consistent nor absolute. It was negotiable when convenient for the regime's needs. The existence of tens of thousands of Mischling soldiers undermined Nazi racial theory's credibility while demonstrating the regime's pragmatic willingness to ignore its own ideology for military advantage. The broader historical context of Mischling in the Wehrmacht reveals disturbing truths about Nazi Germany. The regime's racial ideology was supposedly absolute, and scientific racial purity was proclaimed as essential to German survival and strength. Yet when military needs required it, thousands of soldiers with Jewish ancestry were accepted, promoted, decorated, and even used in propaganda. This reveals Nazi racial theory as fraudulent pseudoscience, applied selectively based on convenience rather than actual belief in its validity. It also demonstrates the regime's fundamental dishonesty and willingness to compromise its stated core principles for practical advantage. The existence of Mischling soldiers also raises difficult questions about complicity and responsibility. These soldiers served a genocidal regime. Many participated in a war of extermination. Their personal persecution under Nazi racial laws doesn't erase their service to that regime. Yet their impossible moral position, serving an ideology that marked them for persecution, protecting families by serving the regime threatening those same families, reveals the complex human realities within totalitarian systems. Understanding their stories doesn't justify their service but illuminates the psychological torture inflicted by Nazi racial policy. Mischling lived in constant fear while simultaneously enabling the regime persecuting them, a position designed to destroy them psychologically regardless of whether they survived physically. Werner Goldberg's story ultimately illustrates several profound historical lessons. First, it demonstrates how racial ideology, when applied as governmental policy, creates impossible and absurd situations. Nazi racial laws were supposedly based on biological science, yet they produced a propaganda campaign featuring a racially inferior soldier as the Aryan ideal. This contradiction exposed the entire system as fraudulent. Second, it reveals how totalitarian regimes force individuals into morally impossible positions. Werner faced no good choices: refuse service and endanger his family, or serve and become complicit in a genocidal war against people like his father. The regime designed this impossible choice deliberately, psychologically torturing those caught in it. Third, it shows how ordinary people become entangled in extraordinary evil through combinations of coercion, fear, self-preservation, and impossible circumstances. Werner was not a Nazi ideologue, he was a young man trying to protect his family while surviving persecution. Yet his service contributed to Nazi military efforts and a war of extermination. Understanding this complexity doesn't excuse collaboration but reveals how totalitarian systems ensnare people. Finally, Werner's story reminds us that historical categorizations of perpetrator and victim often fail to capture individual realities. Werner was simultaneously a Wehrmacht soldier who served Hitler's war machine and a persecuted Mischling targeted by Nazi racial laws. Both truths coexist. Grappling with this complexity honors historical truth more than simplistic narratives. Werner Goldberg's photograph, used to represent Nazi racial ideals while concealing his Jewish ancestry, became one of World War II's most ironic images. It symbolizes the fraudulence of Nazi racial ideology and the tragic absurdity forced upon thousands of Mischling. His story, and the stories of tens of thousands of others caught in similar impossible positions, deserves remembering for multiple reasons. These accounts reveal totalitarianism's human costs beyond the obvious victims. They show how repressive systems torture even those who serve them. They demonstrate that racial pseudoscience is exactly that, fraudulent ideology with no basis in reality. They remind us that historical truth is complex, that people's positions within oppressive systems often defy simple categorization. Werner's service to Nazi Germany cannot be separated from his persecution by it. Both truths must be acknowledged. Most importantly, these stories serve as warnings. They show how racial ideology, when given governmental power, creates impossible moral situations and inflicts psychological torture on entire populations. They reveal how seemingly rational people become entangled in genocidal systems through fear, coercion, and impossible choices. Understanding these mechanisms helps prevent their recurrence. Werner Goldberg's story, the half-Jewish soldier in Hitler's army, the ideal German soldier who was racially persecuted, stands as testimony to Nazi ideology's contradictions and the human suffering those contradictions caused. Stories like this deserve to be remembered, studied, and shared, not to rehabilitate perpetrators, but to understand how ordinary people become caught in extraordinary evil, and how we might prevent such systems from arising again.